managed to do is essentially lobby the rest of Congress to move from, from a state of a confederation of Articles of Confederation into an actual constitution that made this kind of, that gelled the nation much more, in a much more solidified way than it was under the Articles of Confederation.
We had to persuade the states that the nature of their union was ineffectual under a confederated form of government. And we had to change that form of government very pronouncedly to one where the states that were initially sovereign had to give up some of their sovereignty to a national government in those areas in which they would be themselves ineffectual in a small state or in a group of states. Without the Constitution, it probably would have degenerated into 2 or 3 different confederations amongst themselves, the differences that were there. We had to persuade the states to give up that state of sovereignty. In fact, the reference to the state being sovereign was in a sense put to bed. It wasn't put to sleep, but it was put to bed. And the nature of their role within the federal government then changed demonstrably from being entirely independent to being subjoined in one respect to the national government, subjoined in national affairs and completely independent in other affairs that were not of a national character.
So the Constitution essentially lifted some of, or I guess transferred some of the sovereignty from the states to the national government.
It more changed the sovereignty of the states to the sovereignty of the people as a whole.
Now that's really interesting. I'd like you to elaborate on that, because and whether that occurred under the Constitution or whether that occurred when the Bill of Rights, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, when that happened at the Bill of Rights level. So would you say when you were drafting the Constitution that the drafting of the Constitution shifted that power or that sovereignty from the state to the people, which hence explains we the people, or did it shift it to a national government? And what was the perception of different colonies, now states, to that?
The nature of that Constitution, what we sought to establish was to remove the sovereignty of the states, which means entire authority, not presumed authority, but entire authority from each of the states for the people within. And it transferred that authority, the national government, to the people at large, not as a consolidated government, but rather it was relegated to the people as they were represented in their several states. So the states no longer became the fundamental element of the government of the United States. The people were. And the people were represented in that government through their respective states. And in those areas of a national character that were not of a national character, the states retained rights, matters of voting, matters of education, matters of domestic commerce, and so on, how they would negotiate their own internal affairs. But national affairs were given over to the national government, and the substance of authority for that national government were the people at large, as represented in their respective states. This is the essential element of our Constitution. It transfers the sovereignty from the states separately to the people at large, but still is represented to the states. That is the federal nature of that government. Some of the powers left to the states, some of the powers given to the general government. But what exercised total authority were the people at large. And so the authority emanates from the people to the government. The government did not grant rights. It never granted the sovereignty to the people. It was inherent to begin with. The Constitution merely acknowledged it.
It's very interesting that it was the first Constitution in the history of mankind that started with the three powerful words of we the people.
That was instituted by Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris was on the Committee of Style at the convention in 1787, 4 months we spent. And at the very end, the discussions during that convention that created the Constitution, it needed to be placed, it needed to be put in words, it needed to be put in articles. And so the Committee of Style was arranged for that. Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania was one of those members. And he took it upon himself to write a preamble to the Constitution, which said, "We the people." And one of the first objections from Mr. Henry in Virginia during the ratifying convention was, "What do you mean, we the people? It's we the states. We're the sovereign people. We're the states that are creating this Constitution." And I was obviously saying, no, that's not the case anymore, Mr. Henry. For this to survive, for these 13 United States to survive, we needed to vest that interest in the people, so the people created it. And when the Constitution was ratified, when it would become accepted by the people, it was not ratified by the state legislatures. The Constitution stipulated that particular conventions would be established in each of the states, the convention meeting for a certain period of time, as opposed to a Congress, which is perpetual. That the conventions would meet, that they would be composed of individuals representing the people by the most loose form of election possible. The people in the various towns in New England and various counties in Virginia would choose representatives to go to the Virginia ratifying convention in 1788. And it's quite a number to be there, to be sure. But those representatives were not representatives of the legislature. Some were members of the legislature, but they weren't chosen because they were members of the legislature. They were chosen by the people in convention. And that takes entirely the weight off of the legislatures to say, we the states. The legislatures had nothing to do with the ratification.
So you would say that the Constitution was really a ground-up approach, which is, if I compare it to the exercise, the constitutional exercise in Lebanon as it was founded, it was really a top-down approach, which what it tried to do is essentially take some of the constitutional lessons drawn by the time it had been formed and draft rules of engagement of government. But the essence did not come from the people. In fact, if you search for the word citizen within a 12,000 word document, more or less, it's only mentioned once. The essence of the Constitution in the United States is indeed a very, very powerful tool. And that is one thing that we are missing in the Lebanese case.
I should probably clarify just a little bit, because the Constitution, as with so many issues amongst men in community and societies, there are those sagacious individuals in the society who articulate principles that should operate on the people at large. And people can ascribe to those principles. It's not a declaration of practice. It's a clarification of principle. And oftentimes when one looks at the principles and say, this is a good principle, this should be applied in our society, and you look at how the society is operating, you realize that the practice is pretty far away from the principle.
Correct.
But it's still necessary to assert the principle, to draw, to inculcate in the people the sense that these principles exist, and that this is what we move toward. This is why the American government is one of experiment, because we're not accomplished in anything. We are merely proceeding and setting a pace, hopefully, that may be a beacon of light for the rest of the world. I'm continually impressed by you referring to 1920 in the past tense. It's really confusing to me here somewhat. But I assume that there may be emanations in the future where people will be treating with these kinds of subjects. They are perennial subjects. They are never completed in the generation in which they're formed and are expressed. They're constantly have to be, the practice has to be applied to the principle, and that is where the failure of mankind generally comes.
Indeed, and the fascinating thing is, and coming back to your own experiment with the Constitution, is you were the primary drafter of the U.S. Constitution, and yet, less than a couple of years later, you found, and even though initially you were opposed to a Bill of Rights, and that brings us really to this, to the key element of the importance of the Bill of Rights, you and others within the United States were still kind of sensing that something is missing from the Constitution, or something needs to be allayed, some fears need to be allayed. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit the experience when it comes to your thought process as you transferred from the Constitution, which the ink had barely run dry, and moving into saying, wait a minute, the Constitution has some risks here, and we actually need to contemplate certain checks on that Constitution through the instrument which is called the Bill of Rights. I wonder if you'd share a little bit about that experience.
Well, the nature of events in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence is very much a focal point, and articulated as by Mr. Jefferson as it was. It set up a series of principles that all men are created equal. Again, the principle, not necessarily the practice. And from that, if we are declaring our separation from England, we are wanting to establish a new form of government that's not going to follow the monarchies or the dictatorships or the Caesars of the past. It's a new way of looking at people in their role in their own communities. This is an evolution of 150 years of Newton talking about laws of gravity, our knowledge of the natural world. There's an example of Dr. Franklin. For years, religious advocates in various religions were suggesting that God was spiteful. If you defied God, God would take the lightning and strike your house and burn it down. And this idea of a benevolent God or a vicious God, however it would be reframed, was still that natural events that occurred in the temporal world were dictated directly by God. When Dr. Franklin or Newton does his laws of gravity, Dr. Franklin proved the lightning, that the lightning would strike continually the kite that he was flying in a storm, and the lightning would be brought to the Leyden jar. And it would consistently happen. He later developed the idea with Mr. Spencer in France about the lightning rods. If you put large rods that emanate from the ground into the sky above the trees and above the buildings, that the lightning would strike the rods and go to the ground and not strike the building right next. No matter how malevolent the person was owning the house, the lightning would still strike the rod instead of the house. And this idea that the natural world exists, our explorations around the world, Banks' explorations with Captain Cook, the idea that we could explain the natural world in which we lived. Kings were at that time declaring the divine right